Hey everyone, I'm Maria and I am an artist working mainly with pastels and pastel pencils. Today we're doing a small, detailed study on how to draw realistic white fur. I took inspiration from a recent commission of this lovely orange cat and his very fluffy white belly. At first glance, the fur looks almost completely white, but when we zoom in, there are actually so many different shades in there, from very light creams and beiges to some surprisingly dark grays. And it is precisely those differences that will help us create the volume and texture of the fur. For this study, I am working on white Pastelmat paper and I'll be using a combination of PanPastels and Faber-Castell Pitt Pastel Pencils. I'll leave the full list of materials, including all of the colors that I've used, in the description below. For the first layer, I'm using burnt umber medium as my main blocking color. It is quite a bit darker than the overall color of the fur, but that's intentional, as it gives us a solid base that we can gradually build the lighter fur on top of. I apply it using one of the PanPastel soft tools, covering the middle and bottom of the circle quite evenly with a generous amount of pigment. Then, as I move towards the top where the light is hitting the fur, I don't pick up any more pigment, I simply use whatever is left on the sponge, which naturally creates a lighter area and already starts establishing that gradient from shadow to light. I then add some Payne's gray tint to the shadow, which gives me a cooler tone compared to the warm burnt umber underneath, and I follow the rounded shape of the sphere as I apply it, because I already want this gradient from light to shadow to start creating that three-dimensional form. I then add some raw umber tint to the middle and top of the sphere where the fur is catching more light. And at this point, I'm already starting to think a little bit about the texture. So rather than creating one perfectly smooth gradient, I map out these little small sections that almost look like little triangles or wedges. And these will eventually become separate clumps of fur, and they will help break up the surface so the final result feels much more natural. I am always amazed by how beautifully the pun pastels work on Pastelmat. The pigment really grabs onto the surface, but at the same time, the colors are incredibly easy to blend together, so you can create these really soft transitions without completely losing the shapes underneath. So, if you're just starting to work with pastels, I really recommend giving both Pastelmat and Pun Pastels a try, as they make this first layer so much quicker and give you a really nice base to start building your detail on top of. Now that the base layer is done, we can switch to the pastel pencils and gradually start building the texture and the detail. I like to work from dark to light, almost mimicking how the fur itself is layered, with the darker hairs and shadows sitting underneath and the lighter, more exposed hairs gradually building on top. So I start at the very bottom of the sphere with a dark Payne's gray, using a blunt pencil and very gentle strokes. Even at this early stage, I am already following the direction of the fur and those little clumps we mapped out before. I then switch to a lighter, warmer gray and start working towards the middle of the sphere. This also helps soften the transition in color temperature, balancing some of the warmth from the brown underneath with the cooler tones we see in the fur. I am still keeping my strokes quite soft and loose here, just gradually building up that texture. I then gently blend these layers with my finger, just enough to even out the base and reduce how much of the paper texture is showing through. I don't want to overblend here though, because I still want to preserve all the shadows and fur clumps we've already mapped out. I then repeat this process with the same gray, focusing only on the bottom half of the sphere. I keep building up these soft layers and gently blending as I go until I have a nice even base ready for the finer details. I then grab a lighter, cooler gray and start adding some more defined texture to the bottom half. I am keeping the cooler tones in the shadow, and as we move towards the light, I will gradually introduce warmer grays, which helps reinforce that transition across the sphere. My strokes are still very light, but now I'm being more intentional with them, especially around the tips of those little fur clumps. This is where the hairs catch more light. Also, I am following the curve and direction of the fur while adding a few stray hairs here and there, and that little bit of irregularity is what helps everything look much more believable and realistic. I then move on to the lighter top part of the sphere and switch to a warmer light gray. The process is essentially the same, as I focus most of my strokes around the tips of those fur clumps where the hairs are catching the light, and then I work my way towards the center. This way I can start overlapping this warm and cool grays slightly, as I don't want a clear line separating the two areas. So by blending those temperatures through the middle, we can achieve a much smoother transition and bring about these rounded three-dimensional shape. I felt like the middle and top sections were still looking a little flat, so I went back in with a medium light brown to deepen the shadows between the fur clumps. I am still using very gentle pressure here, carefully working around the lighter hairs we've already added. That extra contrast helps separate the clumps and gives the fur a lot more depth. Now that I am happy with the overall values, contrast, and colors, I can move on to the final detail layers. I keep working with a light warm gray, but this time with a nice sharp pencil, adding individual hairs in slightly different directions while still following the flow we established underneath. And even at this stage, I keep the pressure quite light, which helps these strokes stay fine, clean, and sharp. I also used a slightly darker gray to add some texture around the edges on the bottom half of the study. I don't want to keep that perfectly sharp outline on the circle because real fur wouldn't end like that. So I let individual hairs extend slightly beyond the edge, which immediately makes the shape feel softer and much more natural. To finish the bottom half, I keep switching between those three shades of gray, deepening the shadows where I need more depth, bringing some light back into the brighter areas, and gradually adding more detail. If you have watched any of my other tutorials, you've probably heard me saying this before, but it is really crucial with pastels, so work in layers, keep the pressure light, and be patient. Realistic fur takes time, and building those layers gradually is what allows us to create that depth. And a big reason for keeping the pressure light has to do with the tooth of the paper, which I've mentioned before. The tooth is basically the texture of the surface and it's what grabs and holds onto the pastel pigment. Pastelmat does have a beautiful texture surface and can hold a huge amount of pigment, which is one of the reasons I love working on it. But even with Pastelmat, if we press too hard too early, we start flattening and feeling that texture. And once that happens, it becomes much harder for the paper to grab onto any more pastel, and we lose the ability to keep building those fine layers and details on top. I then switch to a white pencil and repeat the same process across the middle and top of the sphere. Again, I'm keeping the pressure light and gradually building up the pigment rather than trying to get that bright white immediately. I concentrate most of these hairs towards the top where the light is hitting the fur most directly, and as I move down towards the middle, I use the white a little bit more selectively. So then we don't lose the gradient we spent all this time building. And even though we are drawing white fur, I don't actually want to make everything white. The white pencil is really there to represent the hairs that are catching the light the most. So, by keeping some of those grays and browns visible underneath and between them, the lighter hairs have something to contrast against. These makes them appear brighter. So, I just keep adding these individual hairs, following the clumps we've already created until the top starts to feel much lighter and fluffier while still keeping the sense of depth underneath. I also love adding a few loose strands at the top using a light ivory yellow. Since it is where the fur is catching the most light, adding that subtle warmth helps suggest the color of the light itself, while also giving the white fur a little more variation and dimension. Then for the very last layer, I switch to a white Caran pastel pencil, and these are incredibly creamy and highly pigmented, which makes them perfect for adding those really bright highlights all over the soft layers underneath. The only downside is that they are much softer than the Faber-Castell pencils, so they lose that sharp point very quickly. Because of that, I sharpen mine quite often and I still keep my pressure very, very light as I add these final individual hairs. If you press too hard, the pencil can deposit a lot of pigment at once and the strokes will become thicker and less even rather than giving us that fine, delicate first texture we want. Once those last little details are in place, our white fur study is complete. And that's it. I really hope you enjoyed this little study and that you found it helpful. If you would like to learn more about drawing realistically with pastels and pastel pencils, make sure to check out the rest of the tutorials. And if you would like to follow along with the next ones, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you in the next one.